topic today is the future of higher education. And it is my sad duty to suggest to you today that the future of higher education, as I conceive of it, is bleak. I should say, starting out, that when I say higher education, I don't simply mean post-secondary education. I take higher to be a more profound quality than that. When I say higher, I mean higher education in the philosophical sense. Higher education is that mode of teaching that is meant to educate, not merely to train. And by educate here, I mean to really nurture the mind, to foster creativity, to nurture curiosity, to establish habits of broad and deep critical thinking, and to impart a love of what we must call, though it sounds old-fashioned, wisdom. Perhaps I'm romanticizing a little bit, but it seems to me that when I was preparing for university, that vision of higher education, the one I just spelled out, was more common if it was not taken for granted. I grew up understanding that university education was to be something very much different from other pedestrian kinds of schoolwork, and that those who sought mainly job training took paths such as trades education or community college. There are a great many people who still share that view, but their numbers are, I suspect, declining, and increasingly it seems to me they are either ignored or are condemned as out of touch and irrelevant. This shift is part of what I will call the big problem with universities today. And when Billy called me last week to ask what the title of my talk was, I should have said the big problem with higher education. I hadn't quite worked all that argument out yet, so you can use that as an alternate title in your mind if you'd like. Anyway, that's a big problem, capital B, capital P. I will try to convey those capital letters with my tone of voice where necessary. This big problem, I will argue, threatens to destroy higher education in its best sense, and indeed may have already administered the fatal dose of poison that may take some time before the victim dies. Once I have explained in more detail just what I mean by the big problem, I will suggest how, in my view, the big problem is getting worse, what its negative effects are, and what, if anything, we might do to solve it. The big problem for higher education, as I see it, is that contrary to the view that I remember prevailing not that many years ago, we have come to the point where it is largely taken for granted that the primary, if not the exclusive reason that any sensible student should have for attending university and being granted a degree is to qualify for a reasonably high-paying job. It is in fact a commonplace these days that university has become what high school used to be, a basic prerequisite for any serious job, even though in fact the vast majority of people still do not go to university. A poll conducted just last week in the UK showed that only 25% of parents considered university education valuable for its own sake. And I suspect that a similar poll in Canada would reveal similar results. Universities themselves, including this one, sometimes foster this job training view as a means of recruiting students. And they show stark graphs indicating how much more the students are likely to earn over their lifetimes with a university degree in the jobs that will implicitly be open to them thereafter. In other words, it is well established now that the primary function of a Canadian university is to provide not so much education, but rather credentials. And this, as I have said, is a big problem, capital B. What I want to argue today is that it is a colossal, catastrophic, self-destructive mistake to think about universities in this way. Because, of course, the more we think about them this way, the more they actually become that way. And in fact, surveying the vista that is Canada's university community, we see everywhere we look institutions of higher education being torn down, metaphorically speaking, and credential factories being built to replace them. Another word for the big problem then might be credentialization. And I will use that term from time to time because you are probably already sick of me saying big problem over and over again. The most obvious, but by no means the only example of the increase of credentialization at Canadian universities is the incredible rise of the Canadian Business School. Indeed, this instance provides an optimum case study because there is no area of the university so obviously and indeed proudly devoted to preparing graduates for specific jobs in a specific field. Exact numbers are difficult to come by, but the most recent statistics I could find suggest that business administration is the most popular university major in Canada, beating the second place finisher, social sciences and law, by nearly half, and almost tripling the number in the liberal arts and humanities. Those of you who are business students, and if the numbers are right, some of you must be, are no doubt asking what's wrong with that. But I want to suggest that while business students and faculty members themselves are just as likely to be fine, upstanding citizens as anyone else, business schools undermine higher education as I have defined it in several ways. First, the presence of business as a major in itself reaffirms the notion that university education equals job training. Perhaps some people genuinely enjoy the study of business as a discipline. It's hard to imagine that very many people enroll in business administration programs simply for the love of the subject matter and without worrying about how their education relates to their future job prospects. Second, as business schools grow, they exert increasing pressure on non-business disciplines to set aside their own missions and provide service courses for their other students. My own discipline, English, provides a good example. More and more English departments are being required to teach composition to business and other professional students as our own numbers of majors dwindle, and we increasingly have to show why we are relevant. This trend is self-reinforcing, fostering the sense that business is a real area of study in itself, while English and other arts disciplines provide merely adjunct skills important only to the extent that they may be useful to the business major or indeed the business professional. At this university, the starkest example is the discipline of philosophy, where a host of brilliant philosophers teach almost no philosophy students at all, but teach instead prospective members of various professions. When we recall that philosophy, the term itself, ultimately derives from Greek words meaning the love of wisdom, we cannot, as Shakespeare said, choose but weep. More important than these, a third problem with business schools is that a great number of rich people donate large sums of money to them. Why is that a problem? Because it's money that might otherwise be donated to programs with higher aspirations than getting the next generation of money managers to manage to make as much money as they can get. Since business schools are part of university, rich donors, who themselves often made their money in business, can make tax-deductible donations to organizations whose aims, while they are not malicious, are not charitable in the normal sense of the term. Such deductions represent a taxpayer-funded subsidy of gifts from one rich person to others who are trying to get rich. Similarly, and perhaps most troubling of all, business schools draw public funds away from other modes of education who aim more directly to serve the broad public good. As it is, we now have an absurd situation whereby vast amounts of public money are channeled through the mechanism of the business school towards the training of employees of private enterprises. In other words, business schools represent a massive and largely unnoticed subsidy of private corporations, whereby training, whose costs ought to be paid by the companies themselves, is paid for largely by the government. To put this in perspective, imagine a world where, instead of providing their own training to the people that they hire, companies told prospective employees that they might be able to work for them, but that the applicant would have to wait 3 or 4 years and pay for their own training during that time. Further, imagine that the companies insisted that the government spend thousands of dollars per year per applicant to contribute to the cost of the training, and for good measure, imagine that even after all that, they wouldn't guarantee there would be a job when the candidate was finished. Wait just a moment, you don't have to imagine it. That is exactly the situation that we have now. I can see at least 3 reasonable objections to my characterization of the big problem. First, one might object that the idea of the university has changed over time, and that what I see as a problem may just be the latest phase of evolution of the university as an institution. Second, that universities have always provided credentials, And third, that there was nothing wrong and maybe something entirely right about providing people with the training they want to get a good job. I'd like to examine each of these objectives in turn. The first objection, recall, is that universities have changed their functions over time at other periods too. In previous ages, for instance, universities were often explicitly religious institutions, and often played a strong role in the training of men for holy orders. And so if the religious function of the university has changed, well, not entirely, but largely, why can't other functions change too? Indeed, much of my own view of the nature of a university comes partly from ideals articulated in the 19th century, so why isn't the present trend just as valid? I have two answers to this objection. First, even centuries ago, universities focused on the liberal arts and sciences as they understood them. In fact, there were 7 such disciplines. The first 3, called the trivium, which is 3 roads, were rhetoric, logic, and grammar. These were followed by the quadrivium, the 4 roads, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The subjects of the trivium were considered basic and preparatory, and for this reason we still refer to subjects that are not particularly important as trivial. And the latter 4 were more sophisticated, dealing as they did with quantities in various ways. By the way, if you're wondering how music is the study of quantity, it was understood then as quantities expressed over time. If it were up to me, I would not necessarily return us to the 7 liberal arts model, but I would note that it is not entirely different from the model of education that I think is still worth saving. Using more modern terms, we can say that rhetoric, logic, grammar, arithmetic, geometry, and music, and astronomy, equate to something like literature, critical thinking, writing, mathematics, fine arts, and science. We could do worse than this as a list of requirements in today's university. In fact, in some cases, we are doing worse. My second answer to this first objection is this. The fact that universities have changed in the past does not mean that any change now is a change worth having. We would not treat other time-tested social institutions so cavalierly. We would not, for instance, abandon participatory democracy by saying, well, before our modern ideas of democracy, we had all sorts of different ways of organizing governments. The meaningful question when changes are proposed to government, the meaningful questions are not whether it has been different in the past, but rather how to organize it now and what its functions should be. The same is true with universities. The issue is not whether universities have changed, but rather what should we really want from them, and how can we best make them serve the good of the people they are meant to benefit. The second objection, that universities have always provided credentials, is a more substantial one, but ultimately no more convincing. It's true, of course, that professional subjects such as medicine and law have long been part of the university curriculum. But the awarding of those credentials, I would argue, is different from the kind of credentialization I've been arguing against. For one thing, it has been long understood that medicine and law are learned professions, which can't be done properly without first achieving a firm grounding in a more general course of study in the arts and sciences. That is why law schools, rightly to my mind, tend to require an undergraduate degree in some more general field before they will permit you to work towards the more specialized professional certification. One should have a basic knowledge of the world, its history, its broad philosophical and cultural traditions before taking up the study of law. The same can be said for prospective medical practitioners who need a solid grounding in biology, chemistry, and I would say some liberal arts, and probably other subjects too, before undertaking their professional training. Further, while a surgeon or lawyer may become wealthy through her practice, the main functions of these professionals is not the generation or management of wealth per se. The real purpose of training physicians is to have a class of people capable of treating illness and promoting health. Similarly, we train people in law because we need them to make our justice system function. These are broad public goods. To them we could add education and probably some other fields too. In theory, of course, we could construe business education in the same way as a means of training those who help sustain a necessary system of commerce. But I've never heard anyone suggest that business students should have a solid general university education before studying business. Indeed, students take business instead of a more general degree. And I have never heard a passionate speech by a business professor to the effect that business training is for the good of society in general. Instead, the focus tends to be on the prospective short-term earnings for graduates and the long-term productivity of the businesses that hire them. The third objection is the most intuitive and thus the most important. Just realize that thus has a lot of implications in it, but we'll move on. So it's the one I will spend the most time on. What's wrong with training people to get good jobs? People want good jobs after all, and most people are going to need a job eventually. There are two things wrong with simply training people for good jobs. First, it doesn't work very well. Generally speaking, people end up doing jobs that they did not directly train for. Consider the case of my own father, who is still working full-time, by the way, at the age of 71. We see that as a good thing in my family, though I guess some people see that as a bad thing. Here is a list of his jobs, starting from his current position and then moving backwards chronologically. Financial planner, insurance salesman, medical headhunter, which sounds a bit alarming out of context, but is simply the person who helps hospitals hire doctors and surgeons for their hospital. Fundraiser, music coordinator, high school science teacher, agricultural representative. His degree is in agricultural science. And as you see, that was his first job. But he has had 7 jobs since then, none of which were directly related to the field, so to speak, that he studied in university. Let that one sink in for a second. My father is not alone. Research compiled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States found that between the ages of 18 and 44, women on average held 10.7 different jobs. What's 0.7 of a job? University professor, man. For men, it was 11.4 jobs between the ages of 18 and 44. The winning long-term strategy, then, would seem to be to master the big thinking skills taught in liberal arts programs. And liberal arts students do learn these skills. When the book Academically Adrift came out last year, much was made about its conclusion that university students overall didn't actually learn very much. But that reading missed the fact that the results varied widely over different disciplines. According to the research contained in that book, liberal arts students showed significant gains in thinking, reasoning, and writing skills. The worst results were among students in education, social work, communication, and, yes, business. A fascinating study by Statistics Canada showed that while graduates in applied programs initially earned more money than graduates from liberal arts and science programs, that wage advantage, as they called it, declined as time went on, and by the second half of workers' careers actually reversed. In the somewhat stuffy language of Statistics Canada, I'm quoting here, this is consistent with the hypothesis that skills acquired in humanities and social sciences programs allow a relatively greater accumulation of human capital after formal school. As another way of demonstrating the limits of training, imagine my own case. Suppose I had decided when I began university that I was going to study something that would have guaranteed me a great job in 20 years' time. What should I have studied then? I suppose I should have done my degree in online social networking, which would have been fine, except that there was no online social networking, because the internet, at least in its modern form, did not exist in those sad and lonely days, let alone social networking websites. More practically, I might have studied journalism. After all, there will always be newspapers, right? Well, not exactly. To be fair, I could have studied computer programming, but even then, there's a pretty good chance I would have gone broke in the dot-com bust of 2000, or I might have become one of those anxious programmers we used to hear so much about, worried about their jobs disappearing into emerging economies, a prospect no one mentioned to me in 1989. My point is that no one could have predicted with any certainty what the job world would be like now, nor can we predict with certainty what the job market will look like 20 years from now, let alone what our own lives will bring. This has always been the justification for genuine higher education, that it provides the student with cognitive skills applicable to any situation. Skepticism and imagination, like newspapers, will never be obsolete. But even so, even if we could predict the job market 20 or 30 years out and fashion degree programs to meet those needs, we would still be making a big mistake. Because as it turns out, people do more than work in their lives. They vote, raise their kids, they volunteer in their communities. These things may not require higher education, but most of them are made better by it. As a good real-world example, consider a jury in a court of law. If you were an innocent person accused of a crime, how well educated would you like your jury to be? Perhaps you disagree, but I, for one, would like a very well-educated jury. I would like a jury filled with members capable of recognizing misleading rhetoric if advanced by a prosecutor. I would like a jury filled with members with a deep understanding of the importance of evidence and how it can be manipulated. A jury filled with people used to challenging authority and thinking deeply about right and wrong and its relationship to law. And if you would want that for yourself, wouldn't you want those same qualities in all juries? For that matter, wouldn't you want those same qualities in your teachers, your legislators, and your engineers? The example of the jury suggests another insight. It doesn't have to be everybody. The quality of discussion among 12 dolts is much lower than among 11 dolts and one genius. Why? Because the genius, if he really is a genius, makes the dolts better thinkers by asking them questions they wouldn't have thought of on their own, by pointing out problems that they wouldn't have thought of either. If you've never seen the movie 12 Angry Men, find a copy, watch it. But wait, couldn't the one genius manipulate the 11 dolts? He could, which is why an even better scenario is 10 dolts and 2 geniuses. Then not only do the 2 geniuses both point out things the dolts didn't see, but they can keep an eye on each other, and the less astute can learn a lot from the arguments that they have. Society as a whole functions like the jury in my example. We don't need everybody to be brilliant, but we need a certain number of people capable of keeping us on our toes, pointing out problems we might otherwise have ignored, of asking questions we might not otherwise have asked, of explaining why another side is wrong, of redefining a problem in a way we would otherwise never have thought about it before. Of course, the small-minded have always been with us. Even in the rosy days of my youth, I recall hearing a certain kind of adult ask a young person what they were studying and hearing English, or, God forbid, dance, would reply, "But what are you going to do with that?" Today, however, I think things are worse. Today, I think we are caught in a large-scale vicious circle that I call the cycle of Philistinism. It starts with credentialization. Seeing education as a credential earning enterprise undermines traditional values of higher education. As a result, higher education becomes understood less a means to broaden one's mind and capacities, and more an investment in one's financial future. Indeed, journalists regularly publish statistics on the estimated return on investment of university tuition, treating it quite literally as a commodity. Next, this increasing sense of education as investment justifies higher tuition fees. After all, people reason if graduates are reaping financial rewards as a result of having a degree, they ought to be the ones paying for it in the first place. We don't buy stocks for people, why should we be buying degrees for them? They should be buying their own degrees, paying their tuition with the dividends that accrue. If you are so foolish as to invest in fine arts or some other discipline that is not relevant to today's globalized world, this view implies you get the financial ruin you deserve. So university tuition fees have continued to rise at what should be an alarming rate. There are plenty of statistics on this, of course. According to the Canadian Federation of Students, if fees had risen at the rate of inflation since 1991, they would be at about 40% of where they are now. Where fees are high, as in Nova Scotia, the increases are said to be necessary to offset government cuts, because current rates of government funding are unsustainable, a term that means essentially more than we would like to pay. Where fees are relatively low, as in Quebec, hikes are justified because they are relatively low, and students who complain are portrayed as coddled whiners. In the pages of the National Post. As tuition fees rise, students become increasingly and understandably concerned about how they are going to pay off their student loans, which they are increasingly likely to need after they graduate. This leads students to choose those programs that they think will offer them the best chance of getting a reasonably high-paying job immediately following graduation, thus furthering the sense that the main purpose of university education is to provide job training. Students who might wish to study literature or philosophy are systematically urged against it because it's just not practical given their future realities. Then comes the step that completes the cycle. The increased focus on jobs justifies raising fees even higher. Credentialization leads to the investment mentality, which leads to higher fees, which leads to further credentialization, and so on ad nauseum. So far, I think I have been entirely successful in showing that the big problem is something that I don't like. As an English professor, I may have also proven beyond a doubt why the big problem is a problem for me. But is the big problem a big problem for anyone else? It is. I would like to suggest at least 3 reasons why. As I've already indicated, credentialization is part of the cycle of Philistinism that results in part in higher tuition fees for students. What do students do in response? It's often argued that students who can't afford the high fees stop going to university, though the evidence for that response is slight. It is fairly clear, though, that they do spend more time working during the school year. Naturally, this means less time for studies, which means less learning, and a gradual reduction in standards as professors increasingly feel that it's unfair to expect a lot of students who have to work 20 or 30 hours a week to make ends meet. The other thing that students do, as I've already suggested, is they take on more debt. According to one estimate, student loans in Canada today total some $20 billion. Of course, debt has a negative impact on students forced to carry it. It can cause financial hardship and consequent stress, but it also produces a social impact. Setting aside other personal commitments that he might have, a student who graduates free of debt has, if not limitless options, at least wider ones. He can work part-time while he writes the great Canadian novel, or he can travel abroad and volunteer for a few years before starting his career. But the student who graduates with a massive debt load has no such luxury. She must be focused on one thing, getting a job, whatever that job may be, to pay back those loans. They cannot be discharged for many years, even in bankruptcy. That it is impossible, or at least difficult, to measure how much is lost to our nation and to our species as a result should not keep us from thinking about that loss. How many works of art are going uncreated because those who would otherwise create them are toiling away in jobs they would rather not be doing? How many hungry and impoverished people are going without food, medicine, and education because we have become a society that makes massive, barely manageable debt a common rite of passage for thousands of its own? A third reason the big problem is a problem we should all care about is that the kind of education that I want to provide has, as I've touched on already, real, if hard to measure, benefits. My interest in genuine higher education is not a matter of vanity, nor is it a matter of abstract principle entirely. Let's take the ability to think critically as an example. One of the most depressing things that I experience is seeing someone provided with an argument that is profound, original, and well supported, and hearing that person reply with something like, well, that's not what I believe. And it's not that people are not always convinced by good arguments. Instead, it's the sense that they do not read to respond to argument in kind. Since everyone is entitled to an opinion, people think it follows that every opinion is equally valid, and that it is rude, if not intolerant, to tell someone that they are wrong. In other words, for a great and growing number of people, the very idea of reasoned argument is irrelevant. For such people, that is, most people, there is no room for debate about abortion, capital punishment, religious freedom, democratic reform, or really anything at all, because their positions, however they came by them, are just what they believe, and that's that. This tendency was brought home to me during a debate I was involved in at a meeting of the university's Board of Governors. The issue was funding for sports programs, and I argued that it was wrong to cut the arts, which at the time were being substantially trimmed, while not touching sports, which I contended were less essential for the purpose of higher education. I gave a whole series of arguments which no one refuted. Still no one spoke to support my view. But the member sitting next to me leaned over and said, "Wow, you're a good debater." What he should have said was, "Wow, you're right." And he should have spoken in my defense. But no one ever says "you're right" anymore. We have become a society of unconvinceables. That the unconvincible society is a bad one should probably go without saying, but perhaps a few words of warning are in order. The unconvincible society changes at best very slowly, and at worst not at all. Slow changes, like the gradual acceptance of homosexuality, gay marriage, and so on, come, someone once said, because as older generations die off, their prejudices die with them. But slow change is often unacceptable. For one thing, there may be problems where slow changes will mean that they come too late. The case of our global climate provides an obvious example. The unconvinceables who believe, contrary to all evidence, that human-made climate change is a myth or a hoax have slowed the shift away from fossil fuels, even though every reasoned analysis says it is necessary and cheaper to make the shift now. Experts disagree on exactly how close we are to irreversible damage, but it's possible it may be soon too late to make the needed changes if it's not too late already. Even in cases where slow change might be acceptable on a broad social level, on the level of particular individuals, slow change may mean lifetimes of needless hardship. Consider, for instance, Canada's Aboriginal peoples. If Canada's Aboriginals were their own country, they would have the 63rd highest standard of living in the world. And yet, year after year, we go by without substantial reform. Meanwhile, thousands go without adequate shelter, education, health care, or in many cases, even a reliable source of clean drinking water. What's required is new dynamic thinking to propose new solutions, and the open-mindedness on all sides to consider new solutions. Sadly, genuinely original thinking and open-mindedness, the values that should be instilled in higher education, are in awfully short supply these days. Is there a big solution to the big problem? Probably not any solution likely to work anytime in the near future. If we are being realistic, I think we have to admit that any proposed big solution, capital B, capital S, is really just BS. To see why any short-term big solution is unlikely, let's consider a few potential big solutions and see if any of them sound workable. Potential big solution number one. Keep reminding people of the value of genuine higher education. This solution has a couple things going for it. For one, it's cheap, and it's consistent with one of the underlying principles of higher education, which is that society benefits from reasoned discourse and thorough debate. Sadly, history, another one of those irrelevant liberal arts disciplines, tells us that even the most fascinating and well-reasoned arguments don't always prevail against a system determined to reject them. Socrates, Galileo, Bertrand Russell, all right, all shamefully mistreated. Besides, reminding people of why real higher education matters is what people like me have been doing for years. It doesn't seem to be working. Potential big solution number two. Fund universities such that all or most students can easily complete a degree without incurring debt. This measure would help reduce the pressure that drives credentialization, and financially it's perhaps more plausible than it sounds at first. The latest Statistics Canada's figures that I could find say that there are just shy of 800,000 full-time students enrolled in university in Canada. And I know we could talk about those numbers for a long time. Do we include part-time students? Do we include international students? And so on. But for the sake of argument, we can then multiply that number by the average tuition cost across Canada and come up with a price tag for what it would cost for the federal government to pay everyone's tuition fees, about $4.2 billion. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. But in context, it's not as much as you might think. The federal government's transfers to provinces and individuals already amount to $157.9 billion, so we're talking about an increase of less than 3%. As another context, consider that the government is preparing to spend $2 billion over the next 5 years on expanding prisons. $4 billion a year doesn't sound quite so crazy after all. The reason that potential big solution number 2 won't work is not that it's entirely unaffordable, but rather that the philosophical damage, the reconceptualization of what a university education is for, is already done. No government will seriously consider making university free as long as they are open to the attack that the public ought not to be paying for a private benefit. As I have been arguing, the majority has already given up on higher education as a public benefit. So the argument is a non-starter. Potential big solution number 3. Privatize business schools and do not allow donations to them to be tax deductible. This solution has the obvious benefit of saving the taxpayers a great deal of money. Some or all of that could be reinvested in the liberal arts and sciences, and those looking to donate to higher education would then be required to spend it where it is more likely to do the most broad good. Potential big solution number 3 is so unlikely to be realized that I hardly need to explain why. Telling rich people that their charities actually have to be charitable is a bit like telling politicians that they ought to be working for the good of the country, not for themselves or their party. One is dismissed as hopelessly naive. By way of conclusion, I would like to say a few final words about the sad, dark future that awaits us all. To be sure, one should always be suspicious of doomsayers. On the other hand, we should be similarly skeptical of the Pollyanna who assumes that everything will be fine because everything always is. Put another way, it is a mistake to assume that human society in general, and our civilization in particular, inevitably moves forward. No society is perfect, of course, and no society is without its advantages. Still, following the advances of classical civilization, Western culture declined into a period of deep stagnation in the Dark Ages, and relative stagnation in the Middle Ages. The latter, medievalists often point out, was marked by some achievement in architecture and philosophy, for example, but those achievements were deeply limited by their devotion to and complicity in the religious and political dictatorships of the period. Gradually, through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and largely to the present day, admittedly with numerous setbacks, even atrocities along the way, our civilization has advanced in learning, in technology, and most of all, in ethics, by establishing fundamental legal rights of all people, greatly improving the freedom of non-white people in white-dominated societies, drastically improving the cultural mobility of the poor and middle class, and vastly increasing the social and political possibilities for women. And it will be easy to think that such advances will continue, as the old Roman proverb has it, per ardua ad astra, through difficulties to the stars. But just as classical civilization was overtaken by fanaticism and small-mindedness, our own growing tendency to look lower and not higher, especially in our education, may very well usher in a new period of Western decadence. Of course, those living in Dark Ages don't see them as such. The ordinary people of 8th century Europe, if they thought about it at all, probably saw themselves as much advanced from the people of ancient Athens by virtue of being Christians rather than pagans. Content in their faith in God, they went about their brutal lives stoically, if not contentedly. Our own Dark Age will likely be similar. Content in the knowledge that our businesses are modern, which really means massive, and efficient, which really means ruthless. We will increasingly valorize wealth and those who amass it and find it quaint that there was a time when people seriously maintained that money could not buy happiness. I began my talk by telling you that I had a sad duty to report that the future of higher education, or indeed of human culture generally as it turns out, does not look bright to me. Now at the end I should clarify by saying that I was speaking only of the immediate, the foreseeable, and the distant future. In the very distant future, rebirth is always possible. Perhaps that is inevitable, even if continuous progress is not. Eventually, the human hunger for freedom, the desire to see and learn and know broadly, our better angels, our higher faculties will demand to be satisfied. And so following the new dark age, humanity may be blessed by a new renaissance, one that may take us even higher than we are now. It is, of course, my sad duty to point out that none of us will be around to see it. Thank you for your kind attention.